The rain arrived in sheets, turning the cobbles of St. James's Square into a slick mirror reflecting carriage lamps and leaden sky. Flower sellers and crossing sweepers huddled against building fronts, their cries muffled by the downpour. Among them, a young woman in a threadbare pelisse worked her way along the line of carriages halted by a tangle of drays and hackneys. Her basket hung heavy on one arm, the last of her violets and sweetbrier wilting beneath a scrap of oilcloth. She moved with a precision that suggested hunger, not merely poverty. Her face, pale and hollowed at the cheekbones, carried a remnant of something finer, an echo of bone structure that cheap muslin could not entirely obscure. As she reached the grandest equipage, its lacquered panels gleaming even in the gloom, a footman stepped forward to wave her back. His hand never made contact. The woman's knees buckled. The basket tipped, spilling bruised petals across the wet stones as she collapsed against the carriage wheel, her head striking the iron rim with a dull crack. The carriage door swung open before any servant could react. The Duke of Ashworth descended into the storm without hat or greatcoat, his expression carved from the same unyielding stone as his ancestral seat. Alexander Harrow possessed the sort of face that demanded obedience without uttering a syllable, a sharp jaw, eyes the color of winter pewter, and a mouth perpetually set in cool assessment. He crouched beside the fallen woman, heedless of the rain plastering his dark hair to his brow. His physician had always complained of his disregard for weather. His valet would lament the ruined silk waistcoat. Neither thought registered. What registered was the gleam of silver at the woman's wrist, exposed when her sleeve caught on a spoke and tore upward. The bracelet was a slender chain of intricate links, from which hung a small medallion etched with a heron rising from a coronet, the Ashworth family's oldest and most private emblem. His mother had worn the identical piece every day of her life. After her death, the set had gone missing, presumed stolen by a disgruntled lady's maid who later vanished into the rookeries. The Duke's hand paused above the bracelet. His mind raced through possibilities: a clever forgery, a pawnshop purchase, a long-lost servant's descendant. Yet something in the plane of the girl's forehead, in the set of her mouth slackened by unconsciousness, tugged at a memory he could not place. "Bring her inside," he ordered, his voice cutting through the rain, carefully. His valet protested from the shelter of the townhouse steps. "Your Grace, the infirmary would be more fitting." "I said inside." Servants lifted the flower girl and carried her through the service entrance, past the scullery maids who stared with open curiosity. The Duke followed, his boots leaving wet prints on marble as he directed them to a guest chamber in the east wing. He caught his sister Catherine watching from the gallery above, her pale fingers clutching the balustrade, eyes wide. When the physician arrived and the house settled into whispered commotion, the Duke stood at the foot of the sickbed and studied the bracelet once more. The medallion's heron matched the signet ring locked in his desk drawer, the ring his father had worn until his death, the ring that bore a secret compartment never opened in Alexander's lifetime. He did not believe in coincidence, and he did not believe this girl was merely a flower seller. His steward quietly informed him that the woman carried no purse and no identification, only a crumpled paper with an address in Spitalfields and the name Eliza written in a feminine hand. No surname. The Duke ordered the bracelet left undisturbed. Then he went to his study, unlocked the drawer, and took out his father's ring. The secret compartment, spring-loaded and untouched for years, opened to reveal a folded slip of parchment, brittle with age. On it, in the late Duke's sloping script, were 3 lines. "The Thornhill child lives. She bears the heron. Find her before I face judgment." Alexander read the words twice. The rain hammered the windows. Somewhere above stairs, a nameless flower girl slept in sheets of fine linen, wearing proof of a crime he suddenly feared his family had committed. He set down the paper, poured himself a brandy, and did not drink it. The glass remained untouched on the desk as the clock struck midnight, marking the end of one era and the trembling beginning of another. Part 2. Eliza woke to the scent of lavender water and the unfamiliar pressure of a feather mattress cradling her spine. For a long moment she simply breathed, her eyes tracing the canopy overhead, silk embroidered with thistles and climbing roses, the sort of thing she had not seen since childhood, though she could not remember whose house or which room. The memory teased and dissolved like mist. A housemaid appeared, all efficiency and averted eyes, and helped her into a clean morning dress that was too fine by half. Eliza's questions met polite evasion. When she demanded to know whose house this was, the answer came not from the maid but from the doorway. The Duke of Ashworth's London residence. You are his guest. The man who spoke was not the Duke. This one was older, with the measured tones of a steward. He escorted her to a small sitting room where breakfast waited, and with it, the Duke himself. Alexander Harrow stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. Morning light made him no less formidable. He turned as she entered, and Eliza felt the full weight of an examination that seemed to peel back layers she had spent years constructing. She had learned long ago that a straight spine cost nothing, and that fear was a luxury she could not afford. She met his gaze without flinching. "You collapsed beside my carriage," he said. "The physician attributes it to exhaustion and insufficient nourishment. You will remain here until you are recovered." "I have no means to pay for such care, Your Grace." "I did not ask for payment." "Then I must decline. Charity of this magnitude places a debt upon the recipient that I cannot honor." A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps irritation, crossed his face. "Sit down, miss." "Eliza, I have no surname worth speaking aloud." He gestured to the chair opposite his. She remained standing. The Duke did not press the point. Instead, he withdrew something from his waistcoat pocket and set it on the table between them. The bracelet. The silver chain coiled in a neat circle, the heron medallion catching the light. "This was on your wrist. I require an explanation." Eliza's composure finally wavered. Her hand moved unconsciously toward the piece before she arrested the motion. "It was my mother's." "Where did she obtain it?" "I do not know. She gave it to me before she died in the St. Clement's workhouse 6 years ago. She told me to keep it hidden and to trust no one with its origin. I have obeyed her." The Duke absorbed this with an impassivity that masked racing thoughts. The workhouse, St. Clement's, that placed her mother, if her story was true, among the desperate and the destitute women who often shed their names along with their dignity. A lady fallen so far might indeed cling to a single token of her former life. "Your mother's name." "Catherine Moore," she said, but she spoke it like a borrowed garment. Alexander studied her face for the lie he was certain must be there. He found instead a tired honesty, the weary endurance of someone who had learned that deception required energy she did not possess. Her skin was too pale, her wrists too thin, yet her speech carried the cadences of educated gentility. A governess fallen on hard times, perhaps, or something else entirely. "You will remain here as companion to my sister," he announced. "Lady Catherine requires distraction from her nerves, and you appear capable of intelligent conversation. You will receive a stipend for your service. The bracelet stays in my keeping until I am satisfied as to its provenance." Eliza's chin lifted. "You would keep my mother's last gift as collateral." "I would keep it as evidence that you are not who you claim to be, or proof that you are precisely who you claim to be. The distinction matters a great deal." She did not understand his meaning, but she recognized an unyielding will when she encountered one. To refuse meant the workhouse or the street. To accept meant wearing borrowed dresses and waiting on the pleasure of a man who looked at her as if she were a cipher he meant to crack. "I accept," she said quietly, "but I will not simper and I will not lie for your comfort." The Duke almost smiled. The impulse surprised him so sharply that he turned back to the window to hide it. "That is precisely what I am counting on, Miss Eliza." As she was led away to meet Lady Catherine. The Duke retrieved the bracelet and closed his fingers around the medallion. The heron pressed into his palm. Somewhere in the east wing, his mother's portrait hung in a rarely used corridor, and in that portrait, around the painted throat, lay the twin of this very piece. He had walked past that painting 1,000 times without truly seeing it. He was seeing now. Part 3. 3 weeks reshaped the contours of Eliza's existence. Lady Catherine, a reed-slender woman of 20 who had retreated from society after a broken engagement, proved to be hungry for companionship without the scrutiny of the ton. The two women spent mornings reading in the conservatory, afternoons walking the walled garden, and evenings playing duets on the pianoforte that Catherine had abandoned years ago. Eliza's playing was imperfect but heartfelt, her fingers remembering lessons she could not recall receiving. The household watched with muted astonishment as Lady Catherine began to smile. The Duke watched most of all. He observed from doorways, from the far end of the breakfast table, from the window of his study that overlooked the garden path where the two women often walked arm in arm. He noted the quiet dignity with which Eliza handled herself, the way she corrected Catherine's French pronunciation without a trace of condescension, the grace with which she moved, none of it acquired in the workhouse. These were the remnants of early training, polished bone-deep before memory could hold its shape. His investigations into the Thornhill affair continued in secret. What he learned painted his late father in shades of avarice and betrayal. Lord Thornhill had been his father's closest friend until a business venture collapsed amid allegations of fraud. The evidence, Alexander now suspected, had been manufactured. Thornhill was ruined, his estate seized, his name struck from the peerage records. His wife, Lady Helena Thornhill, had fled with their infant daughter the night before bailiffs came to take the London house. Neither was heard from again. The bracelet had been a wedding gift from Lord Thornhill to Lady Helena. The heron was the Thornhill crest. Alexander kept these revelations locked behind his ribs as he prepared to host a small musical evening, the first entertainment Catherine had agreed to attend in 2 years. Eliza would be present as her companion, a position that left her neither servant nor guest, a liminal space that made his jaw tighten with a protectiveness he refused to name. The evening arrived draped in candlelight and polite chatter. A dozen guests filled the music room, their silks and satins rustling like moth wings. Eliza sat beside Catherine, her gray gown simple but elegant, her hair dressed by Catherine's own maid. She did not look out of place. That was the trouble. Viscount Henry Stanton was among the guests, a man whose sharp eyes missed nothing and whose tongue delighted in the failings of others. He had known the late Duke and possessed an encyclopedic memory for the scandals of the peerage. Midway through a lackluster aria, his gaze fixed on Eliza's wrist, specifically, on the bracelet that the Duke had returned to her only that morning, his reasons unspoken. Stanton's glass paused halfway to his lips. He set it down with a click that seemed louder than the music. During the interval, he cornered Alexander near the punch bowl. "That companion of your sister," Stanton said, voice pitched low. "An interesting choice. She wears Thornhill silver." Alexander's expression did not alter. "You are mistaken." "I am never mistaken about jewelry, Ashworth. My mother was a Thornhill cousin. That heron and coronet design was commissioned for Helena Thornhill's betrothal. Unique, unmistakable. Your little companion is either a very good thief or a very inconvenient ghost." The word ghost hung in the air between them. Alexander met the Viscount's avid curiosity with a wall of indifference. "I suggest you confine your observations to the music, Stanton. Gossip has a way of rebounding on its source." But the damage was done. Within an hour, 3 separate conversations had turned toward the ruined Thornhills, their names spoken in the hushed tones reserved for the disgraced dead. Eliza felt the shift in the room's attention, the way glances slid toward her and away, the tightening circle of whispered speculation. She sat very still, her hands folded, her face a careful blank. The Duke found her later in the deserted music room, standing before the darkened window. The bracelet glinted on her wrist. "You knew they would recognize it," she said without turning. "You returned it to me deliberately." "I returned it because it belongs to you." "Then you knew what I am." Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her folded fan. "You knew, and you let me walk into that room unprepared. That is not protection. That is a performance." He had no defense that would not sound like an excuse. He had wanted to see how she weathered the storm. He had wanted proof of her mettle. It was a cold, calculating instinct, and hearing her name it aloud made shame curl in his stomach. "I am trying to understand the truth," he said. "The truth," she replied, turning to face him, "is that I have been someone's inconvenient truth since the day I was born. I am weary of being a puzzle for powerful men to solve. Either send me away or tell me plainly who I am." Alexander stood in the half-light, the distance between them filled with all the things he could not yet say. The confession on his father's paper burned in his memory. The heron on her bracelet seemed to pulse with accusation. "Your name is Eliza Thornhill," he said, "and I believe my father destroyed your family." Part 4. The silence that followed was a living thing, coiled and breathing between them. Eliza did not weep or recoil. She absorbed the words with the same still composure that had carried her through every indignity of poverty, and Alexander understood with sudden clarity that this woman had been forged in fires he could not imagine. She asked for the details. He gave them, sparing nothing, because she deserved the unvarnished account. The fraud accusations, the seized estates, the missing Thornhill fortune, rumored to have been appropriated by the late Duke under the guise of debt collection. Lady Helena fleeing with an infant girl, her own family turning their backs for fear of association. The name Thornhill erased so thoroughly from society that an entire generation had grown up never hearing it spoken. Eliza listened with her hands pressed flat against her thighs, anchoring herself to the chair. When he finished, she rose and walked to the fireplace, where the last embers cast faint orange shadows across her face. "My mother never spoke of this," she said. "She worked as a seamstress, then as nothing at all. She coughed blood for a year before the workhouse took us. The only time I saw her weep was when a pawnbroker offered her 3 shillings for the bracelet. She refused and went without food that week." "She protected you from the knowledge." "She protected me from a name that would have made me a target." Eliza turned. Her eyes were dry, but the grief in them was oceanic. "What happens now, Your Grace? Do you silence me as your father silenced my parents?" The question landed like a blade between his ribs. He had spent the past week contemplating precisely that, not in those brutal terms, but in the language of reputation and legacy. A discreet settlement, a quiet departure, the Ashworth name preserved, the Thornhill claim buried for another generation. Her gaze stripped the euphemisms away. "I have considered it," he admitted. "I considered paying you to vanish. I considered denying everything. I sat in this room and weighed your future against my family's honor and found myself reaching for the coward's choice. And now I am looking at you, and the calculation will not hold." He moved toward her, stopping at a distance that preserved propriety but closed the space between argument and something rower. "You are the rightful heir to lands in Hampshire, to funds held in trust by the Crown, to a name that should never have been struck from the record. I can help you reclaim them." "At what cost?" "To me," he almost laughed, "everything. If I acknowledge your claim publicly, I admit that my father was a thief and a liar. The Ashworth name will carry the stain for a century. Every alliance my family has built, every privilege we enjoy, will be called into question. I will be reviled by men who called my father a friend. There is no version of this where I emerge unscathed." Eliza studied him. "Yet you are offering." "I am offering." "Why?" The question was simple and unanswerable. He could not point to the way she read to Catherine, patient and unassuming. He could not cite the way she held herself in the music room while whispers circled like wolves. He could not name the thing that unspooled in his chest when she walked into a room, because numbing it would give it power he was not prepared to surrender. "Because I must," he said. "Because my father wrote a deathbed plea for absolution, and I am the only one who can grant it. Because you collapsed beside my carriage and I have not been able to look away since." Eliza absorbed his words with that same infuriating, admirable steadiness. Then she did something he did not expect. She reached up and unclasped the bracelet, holding it out to him. "Then prove it," she said. "Take this, begin the legal process. Restore my name in the eyes of the law. Until that is done, I will remain here as your sister's companion and nothing more. I will not accept your charity or your guilt. I want what is mine, your grace, nothing less." The Duke took the bracelet. The silver was warm from her skin. He curled his fingers around it and made a vow he had never expected to make to anyone, least of all a flower seller with a fallen dynasty hanging from her wrist. "You shall have it, Miss Thornhill." She flinched at the name, the first time he had used it. A crack in her armor quickly sealed. She curtsied, not prettily but with a precise dignity, and left him alone with the heron pressing into his palm like a judgment. Outside the study door, Lady Catherine stood in the shadows, her hand pressed to her mouth. She had heard everything, and for the first time in 2 years, her eyes held not melancholy but purpose. Part 5. The Duke's offer did not take the shape Eliza expected. 3 days later, he summoned her to the study not with documents of restitution, but with a banker's draft, a sum so large that her eyes refused to focus on the figure. Beside it lay a single sheet of paper, a waiver absolving the Ashworth estate of any future claims or obligations. She stared at the draft, then at him. The man who had spoken of justice now offered a transaction. "This is your solution." Her voice emerged flat, all the fire of their previous conversation banked into something colder and more dangerous. "The legal path is uncertain," Alexander said, and he sounded almost convincing. "Almost. The Crown will contest the claim. It could take years. This provides you with immediate security, a house, an income, a future unburdened by scandal. You could live anywhere, become anyone." "I could become anyone except Eliza Thornhill." "Names are dangerous currency. You know this." "What I know," she said, stepping closer to the desk, "is that a week ago you told me my family was destroyed by your father's greed. You spoke of justice. You spoke of proving yourself. And now you hand me a check and ask me to disappear quietly, as if my existence is an inconvenience to be managed." The Duke's jaw tightened. He had spent 3 sleepless nights arriving at this compromise, arguing with himself that it was the merciful course. A protracted legal battle would expose her to public ridicule. The ton would tear her apart. She had no allies, no resources, no stomach for the brutality of a court fight. He was protecting her from a war she could not win. Looking at her now, he understood that she would rather lose the war than accept a surrender she had not chosen. "The sum is generous," he said, adding the words even as they left his mouth. "The sum is blood money." Eliza picked up the waiver. She read every line, her expression remote. Then she placed it back on the desk with deliberate care and slid it toward him. "I have been hungry, Your Grace. I have been cold. I have sold flowers in the rain while carriage wheels splashed mud across my only dress. I have buried my mother with nothing but a borrowed shroud and a prayer whispered in a pauper's cemetery. Through all of it, I had one thing that could not be taken from me. The knowledge that I was my mother's daughter, that somewhere in my past there was a truth worth surviving for. You are asking me to trade that truth for comfort. I will not." "Then you are a fool." "I am a Thornhill. Apparently that makes me many things. A fool may be among them, but a coward is not." She walked to the door. Her hand was on the handle when his voice stopped her. "If you leave this house, you leave with nothing. No reference, no position, no protection. You will be a woman without means in a city that devours women without means." Eliza looked back at him, and the Duke felt the strange sensation of being weighed in scales he did not control and found wanting. "I entered this house with nothing," she said. "I am not afraid to leave the same way." The door closed behind her with a soft click. Alexander stood motionless behind his desk, the banker's draft curling slightly in the heat of the lamp. He had been outmaneuvered by a woman who wielded nothing but her own integrity, and the defeat tasted like ashes. Upstairs, Eliza gathered her few belongings with steady hands. Lady Catherine appeared in the doorway, her face pale with distress. "You are leaving. Your brother has made his position clear." "My brother is a fool who has spent so long protecting the family name that he has forgotten the family is made of people, not reputations." Catherine crossed the room and pressed a small velvet pouch into Eliza's palm. "My mother left me a few pieces she did not include in the inventory. Sell them. Find a solicitor. Fight." Eliza shook her head. "I cannot take your jewels." "You can and you will. I have spent 2 years hiding in this house while the world went on without me. You walked in with nothing but a basket of dead flowers and reminded me what courage looks like. Let me be part of this, please." The two women embraced, and when Eliza finally descended the servants' stairs and slipped out through the mews, her eyes were wet but her spine was iron. The Duke watched her go from the window of his bedchamber, a tall figure in the rain, and did not move until she vanished around the corner of the square. Only then did he allow himself to feel the full weight of what he had done and what he had lost. Part 6. The rooms above a print shop in Paternoster Row were cramped and perpetually scented with ink and drying paper. Mrs. Alice Henshaw, a widow who had once served as governess to a viscount's daughters, rented them cheaply and asked few questions. When Eliza appeared at her door with a velvet pouch and a story trimmed to its essentials, Mrs. Henshaw offered tea and a trundle bed without demanding payment. "You will need a solicitor," Mrs. Henshaw said the next morning, setting bread and butter on the scarred table. "Not a fashionable one. It will write pretty letters and accomplish nothing. You need a terrier, someone who remembers that the law exists to serve justice, not the other way round." The terrier came in the form of Mr. Phineas Dawlish, a narrow-shouldered man with ink-stained cuffs and a perpetual squint. He listened to Eliza's account in a cramped office above a chandler's shop, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm on his desk. When she finished, he removed his spectacles and polished them with his cravat. "The Thornhill claim," he said. "I remember the case. I was articled to a firm that represented a creditor. The fraud evidence was threadbare. Every clerk knew it, but no one dared challenge a Duke. If what you say about the late Ashworth's confession is true, this is not merely a civil matter. It is a scandal that reaches into the Privy Council. Can it be won? It can be fought. Winning depends on evidence we do not yet possess and the willingness of one particular Duke to unburden his conscience. Given that he tried to pay you off, I would not wager my supper on his cooperation." Eliza folded her hands in her lap. "Then we proceed without him." Dawlish grinned, revealing crooked teeth. "Miss Thornhill, I believe we shall get along." Across Mayfair, the Duke of Ashworth was discovering that a house without Eliza in it had become a house of echoes. Catherine refused to speak to him beyond monosyllables. The conservatory where Eliza had read aloud stood empty. The pianoforte gathered dust. Even the servants moved with a subdued air, as if mourning a presence they had not realized they valued. Alexander threw himself into estate business, but ledgers blurred before his eyes. He found himself standing in doorways where he had once watched her pass, remembering the precise angle of her chin when she refused his money. The banker's draft still lay on his desk, unsigned and accusing. The breaking point came on a gray Tuesday when he finally entered his father's private study, a room he had avoided since inheriting the title. The late Duke had died there, slumped over his desk, and the room had been sealed by the housekeeper's order. Dust lay thick on every surface. The air smelled of decayed paper and old secrets. Alexander searched methodically, driven by an instinct he could not articulate. He found the letter in a locked compartment behind a false book, the leather cover titled Parliamentary Procedure masking a hollow interior. The paper was folded tightly, sealed with the Ashworth heron pressed into crimson wax. His father's handwriting, spiky and agitated, filled 3 pages. It was a confession, full and unsparing. The fraud had been fabricated, the evidence planted. Lord Thornhill had been ruined not through business failure but through envy. The late Duke had coveted Thornhill's political influence, his beautiful wife, his easy charm. He had destroyed a man because he could not bear to stand in his shadow. The final paragraph was written in a shakier hand, clearly added later, closer to death. Find the child if she lives. Return what was taken. I have left funds in trust, sealed with my signet to be used for her restoration. This is not absolution. I do not deserve it, but it is instruction. Break the seal. Do what I lacked the courage to do. The heron must fly again. Beneath the signature was the seal code for a bank in the city, untouched for 20 years. Alexander sat in his dead father's chair, surrounded by the dust of old sins, and let the truth settle into his bones. He had been raised to protect the Ashworth legacy. He now understood that the legacy itself was built on a crime. Protecting it meant perpetuating the crime. Dismantling it meant becoming the man his father could not be. He thought of Eliza walking into the rain with nothing but her name. He thought of her mother, dying in a workhouse while jewels sat locked in a city vault. He thought of the bracelet, still in his waistcoat pocket, warm from its years against her skin. By nightfall, Mr. Phineas Dawlish received an unexpected visitor at his cramped office. The Duke of Ashworth carried a leather portfolio and wore the expression of a man who had walked through fire and emerged singed but resolute. "I believe you are representing Miss Thornhill," he said. "I have documents that may assist your case, and funds held in trust for her which I am here to release." Dawlish did not trouble to hide his astonishment. "Your Grace, this is unexpected." "It is overdue." Alexander placed the portfolio on the desk. "Use what you need. There will be resistance. My father's allies will attempt to discredit the claim. I will testify publicly if required." "May I ask what prompted this change of heart?" The Duke did not answer for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and stripped of its accustomed authority. "A woman who walked away from a fortune because she valued truth more. I have been chasing shadows of honor my entire life. She showed me what it actually looks like." Dawlish opened the portfolio and began to read. His eyebrows rose steadily toward his receding hairline. "This will do," he said. "This will do very well indeed." Part 7. The Court of Chancery rarely saw a hearing so charged with whispered history. The chamber was crowded with legal clerks, curious journalists, and members of the ton who had followed the Thornhill case with the same macabre fascination they usually reserved for murder trials. The Crown's solicitor had argued forcefully that the Thornhill title was extinct, the estates forfeit, the claim time-barred and inconvenient to too many vested interests. Eliza sat beside Mr. Dawlish in a gown of deep blue that Lady Catherine had sent to her lodgings with a note reading simply, "Wear this. Make them remember your mother." The color suited her. It turned her pallor to porcelain, and her steady gaze to something luminous. She had refused the Duke's money, but she had accepted Catherine's dress, understanding that pride served no purpose when justice hung in the balance. The hearing was nearing its conclusion, the judge's expression inscrutable, when the doors at the rear of the chamber opened. Every head turned. The murmur that followed was the rustle of 100 startled breaths. The Duke of Ashworth walked down the center aisle dressed in unrelieved black, his signet ring catching the light. He carried a leather folder and made directly for the bench, ignoring the stares and the furious whispers. His solicitor, hastily retained that morning, followed with an expression of barely controlled professional terror. "Your Lordship," Alexander said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I request permission to submit evidence relevant to this case." The judge, a gaunt man with the face of a displeased hawk, peered down at him. "Your Grace, this is highly irregular. You are not a party to these proceedings." "I am the son of the man who caused them." Alexander placed the folder before the clerk. "This contains a full confession, written and signed by the late Duke of Ashworth, admitting to the fabrication of evidence against Lord Thornhill. It also includes banking records proving the existence of trust funds established for the Thornhill heir, funds I am here to release. I stand ready to testify under oath to the authenticity of these documents." The chamber erupted. The judge's gavel fell repeatedly, calling for order. Eliza sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her eyes fixed on the Duke's profile. He did not look at her. His attention remained on the judge, his bearing that of a man who had weighed his world and found it wanting. Mr. Dawlish was already on his feet, arguing for the document's admission. The Crown's solicitor objected, his face flushed. The judge called for a recess to examine the evidence. In the hallway outside, the crowd parted around Eliza like water around a stone. She stood alone near a tall window, the gray light falling across her face. When Alexander emerged from the chamber, their eyes met across the marble floor. He approached slowly, as if she were a wild thing that might startle. "I should have brought the confession sooner. I should have walked into this courtroom the day after you left my house." "Why did you?" Her voice was hushed, unsteady for the first time since he had known her. "Because I have spent my life guarding a name that was not worth guarding. You are worth guarding, not because you need protection, you have proven abundantly that you do not, but because some things deserve to be preserved at any cost." He paused, searching her face. "I am not asking for forgiveness. I am not asking for anything. I simply needed you to know that I understand now. I understand what my father took from you, and I will spend the rest of my life returning it if you will permit me." The recess ended. The judge returned with a ruling that stunned the chamber. The confession would be admitted, the trust funds released, and the Thornhill claim formally recognized. Eliza Thornhill was declared the lawful heir to the Thornhill estates, with all rights and dignities restored. The applause was scattered but genuine. Journalists scrambled for the doors. Viscount Stanton, seated in the gallery, rose and departed with a face like thunder, his own hopes of claiming a distant Thornhill inheritance now dashed. Eliza stood in the emptying chamber, the weight of her reclaimed name settling around her shoulders like a mantle she was still learning to wear. Alexander remained a respectful distance away, waiting. "Your Grace," she said, and the formality was softened by something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "I believe, under the circumstances, you may call me Alexander." "I may, whether I choose to is another matter." He accepted the gentle rebuke with a nod. "I understand. There is much to rebuild and much that may never be rebuilt between us, but if you will allow it, I would like to try." Eliza looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the Duke who had offered her money to vanish, but the man who had walked into a courtroom and laid his father's sins bare before the world. She saw the cost written in the shadows beneath his eyes, the new lines around his mouth. He had not done it to win her. He had done it because it was right. That distinction mattered more than any declaration of feeling. "Walk with me," she said. "There is a garden near Lincoln's Inn. I used to sell violets at the gate and imagine what it looked like inside." They walked through the cold afternoon, past the chancery courts and the barristers in their wigs, past the coffee houses and the booksellers, until they reached the small walled garden. Winter had stripped the roses to thorny canes, but the evergreen hedges stood tall, and a low stone bench offered a place to sit. They talked for hours, their breath misting in the chill air. He told her about the letter, about the locked study, about the ring she had never seen but that matched her bracelet. She told him about her mother's final days. The words she had whispered through fever, "Remember who you are," words that made sense only now. He did not reach for her hand. She did not offer it, but the space between them on the bench grew smaller as the afternoon faded. "It will take time," she said at last, as the lamplighters began their rounds. "Trust, once broken, does not mend because of a courtroom gesture, however grand. I am patient. You are a duke. Dukes are famously impatient. I am a duke who has learned that some things cannot be commanded, only earned." He turned to her and his voice dropped to something raw and unguarded. "When you collapsed beside my carriage, I thought you were an inconvenience. I was a fool. You are the only person who has ever looked at me and seen not a title but a choice. You made me choose between my name and my honor. I chose badly at first. I will not choose badly again." Eliza looked down at her wrist. The bracelet was back where it belonged, the heron glinting in the lamplight. She had worn it into the courtroom, and she would wear it every day of her life. "Then we begin," she said, slowly, with tea perhaps and conversation and no more banker's drafts. He laughed, a quiet, surprised sound, and for the first time she saw the man beneath the title, a man who had dismantled his own fortress stone by stone. The garden gate creaked open. A flower seller, a young girl with violets in her basket, peered in at them and quickly withdrew, embarrassed to have interrupted. Eliza watched her go, remembering herself at that age, hungry and hopeful and wearing a secret on her wrist. "Alexander," she said, testing the name. He looked at her, and the hope in his eyes was almost too bright to meet. "Ask me again in the spring," she said. "When the roses bloom, ask me then what you want to ask me now." The Duke, Alexander, inclined his head with a humility that would have astonished anyone who knew him. "I will wait, and I will ask, and whatever your answer I will have earned it." They rose from the bench. He offered his arm. She took it, and together the flower girl and the Duke walked out of the garden and into a London twilight that held, at last, the fragile promise of spring. And